Hello and welcome to this video of Python programming. In this video, we will learn about error handling and exception handling. So, there are two kinds of errors. One is syntax error. For example, this one. If we try to assign 0 to x, then it is a syntax error. See how Visual Studio Code's linter has underlined this with red line because it's a syntax error to assign inside if expression in Python. If you try to run this, then Python interpreter will complain that it is invalid syntax. So we have to assign it 0. Let me comment out this. Now we will look at how we can do error handling. So for example, this code. We have a function f in which x is 5. If x is equal to 0, then it returns false, otherwise it returns true. Now we can call this function f inside an if else, and if it is false, it prints function return false, otherwise it will print function return true. So since x is 5, the boolean value will be true, so else will execute and it will return true. So you can see the output here. So it returned true. If we change this to 0, it will return false. So similarly, when an error occurs in your code and you expect that it should be returned as a code, then you can use return to code. But then there are exceptional situations in code which you cannot write code for, or you cannot anticipate that it will happen. So the example of exceptions are, this one is division by 0 error, this is name error, and it is type error, because you cannot concatenate type string with integer, or you cannot add 10 string with integer 0. So we will have three different exceptions. We will see them one by one because program will crash because the exceptions are not handled, so we will have to see them one by one. So now we look at the first exception. It gives us division by 0 error. Now we will look at second exception. It will give us name error because y is not declared. Now we look at third exception, which will give us type error. So now we look at next piece of code. This code, all this code has come from the tutorial of docs.python.org. So you can go and read there also. Suppose you want to take an integer as input. So you write this kind of code. Now this code can throw an exception because in the integer which has been supplied by the user of the program may not be an integer. It may be a mistake or it may be deliberate. So we run this in a while loop. It tries to get an integer, and if it finds an integer, then it breaks. But if there is a conversion error here in the int function, it will cause an exception of type value error and will say that that is not a number, and while loop will continue. So unless an integer is supplied, it will go on repeating. So you should look at the two keywords try and accept. Both start a block. So like if or for, they at the end of the line you have to give a colon. So exception, the code below exception block will occur only if there is an exception in the code between try and accept block. So let's see this in action. So it asks for a number, we say ty. So it says that is not a number. We give something like this, that is not a number. But if we give it 6, It takes happily and while loop breaks. Now we look at the classes of exception, that how we can do it in exception. Now in this case, one moment, I think this should be CBA. Okay. So we have a class A derived from the base exception class. We have a class B from derived from A and class C derived from B. So we iterate over a list of CBA and we raise an exception of type class, and we accept class, that is it will be either C, B or A, and we catch those here. Let's see how it works. It printed only A. So the reason is we will have to bring A down because the derived class also matches to base class for type. So now it should print ABC. Now it will print ABC. The reason it printed A in the first class is because the exception for class B or class A or class C all will match with class A because A is the base class. So we have seen how we have raised an exception with raise statement, and then multiple except blocks are there. So if you want, you can cache this all in one except block like so. You can do this CBA and you can say an exception occurred, but you don't know which one. So we now move on to next code example. I already should have a file, myfile.txt, which I should delete. Yes, I will delete this file. Now, what we are trying to do in this code is we are trying to open a file and then we try to read a line in it. And if it is an integer, then we strip the line of white spaces and we try to convert it to integer. If it's an integer, then it is all good. But since the file is not there, it will cause an OS error. If there is not enough permission on the file, that will also cause OS error. Now, if integer conversion is not possible, then it will raise a value error. Otherwise, it will cause an unexpected error. So let's see how it works. So it called an OS error. That is, it also read an error number. It is a Unix error number 2. No such file or directory. So we create myfile.txt. Now we run it. So it says could not convert data to an integer. So we give it an integer 100. Now we try. So it passed because 100, it was able to convert 100 to an integer. Now we look at the else clause. There can be an else clause by try followed after try and except. So there can be multiple except clauses, but there can be only single else clause. So these statements must be executed if exception does not occur in in try block. The reason of writing this code out, we could have as well written it inside try block. The reason of writing this outside is that you do not want to catch unwanted exception because the code may be exception safe. So you want to write it in the else block. The main reason of this is that you don't want to catch unwanted exception, or if you know the code is exception safe, then you write it outside. So in this case, we will have to supply it with an argument because it takes file name from an argument. So we supply myfile.text. So it says that myfile.text has one line. But if we say change its permission, then it will throw an error. It says cannot open myfile.txt. Now let's move on to next example. So in this case, what happens is you can construct an exception and raise it with raise. So exception can be constructed with exception class and you can pass it arguments. When you write the except statement like except exception as e, then e is the instance of the exception. And you can print the type here, you can print the args here, or you can simply print e, which will print the arguments because it has a underscore underscore str underscore method written for it, for the exception class, that is. So let's see this. You see, first it prints the type, then it prints the args, or if you simply print the exception, then also it will print arguments. Now if a function throws an exception, like this one will throw a division by zero exception, you can catch it outside even though it does not raise an exception, like literally by writing raise, or if denominator is equal to 0 raise exception. Usually such code should be written with care, that is, if before dividing you should check whether the number is 0 or not, or the caller will have to catch the exception. So in this case it will fail because it will cause zero division error. So let's see what message we get from the zero division error class. The class gives us the message division by 0. So an exception is read like so. We have already seen this. Or you can simply call the class name without parenthesis or without argument and it will work. Oops. Over here, we raise an exception of type name error with argument x. Here, we say that we are not handling it, we are re-raising the exception. So in this case, the caller of this piece of code will have to handle it. Name error will be raised again. Let's see how it works. So we get name error x here. Similarly, raise has a from clause like this, where none can be an imported name as well. So it will raise a runtime error. Now we have a finally statement. A finally statement will always execute as the last task for the try block. Whether exception occurs or not, it will always execute. So for example, we see this. So it prints goodbye and after that exception is raised. The typical uses of finally is to perform cleanup tasks. For example, a session of a database is used to commit the query. Now, for example, you are writing a web application or desktop application where you are sending data to database and you try to commit. So, if your SQL query is wrong or some network problem happens, then it will raise an exception. But you want to close the session because you do not want too many sessions open connected to the database. Usually it is persisted. But suppose there is a network connection error, or maybe the DB server has gone down. So in that case, you want to close the connection and then terminate the process. So in those cases, session.close is called in the finally clause. So since we do not have a session variable of database, we cannot execute this code. It is just for your information. Now with finally clause, there are some rules. Let me format this. So you can read this for yourself. I'm not going to read it out for you. So you should pause the video here and read these for yourself. Or maybe I'll read it for you, because if I don't read it, what is the point of making a video? If an exception occurs during execution of the try clause, the exception may be handled by an except clause. If the exception is not handled by an except clause, the exception is reread after the finally clause has been executed. That means if you do not handle it here, the finally clause will execute before re-raising the exception. And if it is there, then it will execute as the last statement. If an exception could occur during execution of an except or else clause, again the exception is reread after the finally clause has been executed. If the finally clause executes a break, continue, or return statement, exceptions are not reread. So, for example, over here, if it is a break of a loop, continue, or return, and you do not handle exception, then those will not be reread. So you have to be careful with finally when you have a break, continue, or return statement. If the try statement reaches a break, continue, or return statement, the finally clause will execute just prior to the break, continue, or return statement's execution. If try clause has a break, continue, or return over here, then finally will execute just before that. If a finally clause includes a return statement, the return value will be the one from the finally clause's return statement, not the value from the try clause's return statement. So suppose you have a return statement here, you have a return statement here. Then finally clause's return statement will override try clause's return statement. Now let's see how we execute this with function. So suppose we have a division function, we have result x by y, we have exception 0 division error, other else clause with print result, and finally with finally block. So we execute this. There are three calls to division with 2 comma 1, 2 comma 0, and strings 2 and 1. So first it prints result is 2 because 2 by 1 executes successfully. And after that finally clause executes. So else executes first before finally. The second one will throw an exception division by 0, and then it runs finally block. In the case exception is not handled, what happens is finally block executes over here. And then since exception is not handled, it is re-raised. So you see how it works. Now there is something you should know about. Hang on. There is something you should know about cleanup of stuff. For example, a typical way of reading a file could be this. The problem here is, suppose something happens in the code after for loop. There is an exception. In that case, the descriptor which is uh, open for this file will not be closed and program will crash. Or it may not crash, it depends how the code is written other than this. But in any case, there is a chance that if code is not written properly, this descriptor will remain open. But if you write the same code like this, then this will always close the file descriptor of the program. So when you are dealing with file or network sockets, or when you open any, whenever you use open call, then should use with statement so that the resource is properly cleaned up. With this, we come to an end of exception and error handling. In my next video, I will make it about scopes because I have not dealt with scopes yet because our programs were not large enough. But now I think I should cover scopes, and then I will cover meta classes, and then we will take a tour of standard library. When I will deal with standard library, I will not go through everything, but important selected stuff and useful stuff which we do in day-to-day life. And then recipes will be provided for common tasks. So I hope that you have found this video informational and useful. So if you like this video, then please subscribe to the channel and click the like button. Thanks a lot for watching. Happy programming.